Good morning. It's Richelle Smith here. I am speaking to you from my lounge on a Monday morning because yesterday I had some technical issues which meant I couldn't record this sermon at our modern service. So here we go. This is just for you online. This week we are thinking about we're starting Advent a little bit early because we want to fit in some really great talks on really great themes. The one this week is on waiting. And our reading today is from Isaiah 52, verses 7 to 10. So here it is. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news, who proclaim peace, who bring good tidings, who proclaim salvation, who say to Zion, your God reigns. Listen, your watchmen lift up their voices. Together they shout for joy. When the Lord returns to Zion, they will see it with their own eyes. Burst into songs of joy together, you ruins of Jerusalem, for the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord will lay bare his holy arm in the sight of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth will see the salvation of our God. Now, I don't know about you, but I seem to always be waiting for something. Right now, we're doing a home renovation and it's been going on for a very long time. I'm waiting for it to end, but the bit I'm waiting for the most at the moment is for my new kitchen to be delivered. It's due to be delivered in 10 days. It's very exciting. It's been a long and tricky wait. But you know what? Once my kitchen arrives, then I'm going to be waiting for it to be fitted. And then, of course, the counter needs to go in, and then the floor, and then I've got to do the lounge, and then the girls' bedrooms. And then after that, I'm going to be waiting for my garden to be done. Then we're going to be saving up because we've got some more projects in mind. And you know what? It feels like the waiting is never going to come to an end. Now, our scripture today is a tiny section of the Israelites' story. The Israelites are God's chosen people, and their story is one of perpetual waiting. Let's go back and remind ourselves a little bit of some of those significant waiting periods for the Israelites. So it starts right at the beginning with Abraham and Sarah, and God chooses Abraham to be the father of his chosen people, of a great nation, to have more descendants than stars in the sky and grains of sand. And God makes this wonderful promise, and he says that your descendants will share the good news of who I am with all of the nations, so all the ends of the earth will know who I am. But that was a promise that wasn't fulfilled for 25 years. Abraham and Sarah struggled to conceive, and it was 25 years before they gave birth to Isaac. That's a long time to wait. And in some ways they coped with that waiting incredibly well, probably better than I would have done. But they also really struggled. They doubted this promise. There was also some really bad choices that they made during that waiting period because they were eager for that promise to be fulfilled more quickly than God had in mind. And we then move on, and there's more waiting in the Israelites' story. So it starts right at the beginning. But then Isaac's grandson, Joseph, he has a long period of waiting. And we'll know God gave him messages through dreams and promised him that he was going to be the ruler of a nation. He wasn't very wise with the way that he shared this information with his brothers and rather upset them. But he had this long period of waiting, and it was a hard period of waiting for Joseph because he was rejected by his family. He was sold into slavery. He ended up in prison. Now, we don't hear that Joseph struggled with his faith in the promise that God gave, but I wouldn't be surprised if he did. I would have done. And I wonder how you would have coped in that situation, having God's promise and it not being delivered, and actually it looked like the complete opposite was happening. That would have been hard waiting. And then, of course, we know that that promise to Joseph was fulfilled. He did become one of the rulers in Egypt, overseeing all of the food and distribution. And that meant that God's people were able to be rescued from starvation. And they moved to Egypt in order for that to happen. But they stayed too long. And as the generations went by, it was forgotten what Joseph had done, and they ended up becoming a threat because of their great number, and they became slaves in Egypt. And then there was another really significant period of waiting for them, waiting and praying that they would be rescued from slavery in Egypt. That was a hard, long wait. And then, of course, we know that God did, through Moses and through a lot of incredible miracles in the plagues, and going through the sea and all of that, God showed incredible strength and rescued them. But then there was more waiting, because once they got to the land that was their homeland, they doubted whether their God was able to give that land back to them. And God said, okay, I think you need some more waiting here, guys. And they ended up being in the desert for 40 years. And there was a lot of complaining we hear about. Don't blame them about that particularly. But there was also some incredible miracles during that time. God gave them food from heaven to eat. I'd love to taste manna. Wouldn't that be amazing? But also he taught them a lot. That's where he gave them the 10 Commandments, helped give them a framework to be able to live by. He did a lot in them. He grew them in the desert. Now, I expect you can probably relate to quite a few of those frustrations and struggles. The frustrations of waiting. I wonder what you're waiting for at the moment. We will all be waiting for something, because God actually built waiting into the fabric of the world, because waiting's good for us. We know that with nature, don't we? And we plant a seed, it doesn't immediately grow. We have to wait. We have to wait for the seasons to come and go. And we can't Amazon Prime absolutely everything in our lives. But that's good. That's really good for us. Because in the waiting, we learn about ourselves. The way we respond behaviourally and emotionally and mentally to the waiting period, it shows us a lot about ourselves. And it brings out things that maybe we don't feel very comfortable with. Maybe we don't handle it always as well as we'd like to. But we then have an opportunity, if we choose to take those things to God so that he can help us work through those. Also, we value things so much more when we've had to wait for them. Waiting is an opportunity to slow down, to seek what God is doing, to notice the little miracles along the way, and to grow. Now, our reading from Isaiah comes after, time frame wise, it comes after the desert. The Israelites have gone back to their homeland. They've had several kings, and they are now at a point in time where they have rebelled against God. They are not following God's commandments. They're not living in the way God wants them to, and they are not recognizing him fully as God. And Isaiah is a prophet. He's someone who receives messages from God and delivers those to the leaders of Israel and of Jerusalem. And he had, the message that he had from God was one of judgment and of hope. Judgment because there's a consequence to rebelling against God. And he explained that that judgment was going to be exile. They were going to be taken away from their homeland. But hope, because that judgment was an opportunity for purification. God wanted to purify that. Press the reset button, if you like, during that period. And that the exile would come to an end. There was hope it would end. And they'd then be able to return home. And when they returned home, that would be a fresh start for them and God. And they would be able to then see that God had fulfilled everything he had promised. All the messages he had given Isaiah had happened, and they would have been able to look back on that and see the bigger picture, understand why it happened, and know that God had been at work in all of it. And through that, they would then be able to share with all of the nations about this God that they had come to know and love again. And the verses that we've got here, they're multi-layered actually, because we can look at it as it's about the exile and then coming back. And actually, as a little aside, I found this really interesting. I've been a Christian all my life, and I hadn't reflected on this before. Heard hundreds of sermons, hundreds of thousands of sermons probably, and never heard anyone mention it. But Isaiah gave his message of judgment and hope when he was alive, obviously, before the exile happened, obviously, because that's what he was predicting. But the exile didn't happen until 100 years after Isaiah gave that message. Isaiah had died before the exile happened. So whose is this voice that we're reading, that we're listening to when we read the verses in Isaiah? Because the exile has come to an end in these verses. Isaiah isn't alive. And there's two theories, and this is the interesting part for me. Two theories. One is that when Isaiah was giving these messages from God, God prophetically transported him in time to the point in time where the exile had come to an end, and God gave him a message which was direct for those people of that generation when that had happened. Another theory is suggested actually in Isaiah itself, in the book of Isaiah, and it explains that when Isaiah's message had been rejected by the leaders, he wrote them all down on scrolls and he sealed them up and he gave them to his disciples, and they passed them down to more of Isaiah's disciples. And so this theory is that when the exile came to an end, Isaiah's disciples opened up the relevant scroll, which had the message from God about the exile coming to an end and what happens after that. And they were able to apply that message from God through Isaiah. They could apply that to their current time, to that current generation. I just thought that was interesting. But anyway, so it's multi-layered, these verses. One is it's absolutely explaining the end of exile and how that is joyful and how the news can be spread, that they can return home and how they return home with joy and sharing that. Another is talking about actually sharing with the nations, sharing who God is through the nations. Let's be missionaries. Let's share that. And another is talking about actually when Jesus came. And we know that the Israelites, they returned home and it didn't quite work out in the way that it could have done. They actually felt a little bit bitter towards God, feeling as though the punishment wasn't quite just. They doubted God. They didn't pay enough attention to what God had said, how he had predicted it, and how he had said he would work through it. And so they never quite got to the point of sharing it with all the nations. And we'll remember that was the whole aim, wasn't it, of choosing Abraham, of having this chosen people, was so that ultimately God could be shared with everyone. And it still didn't happen. So God needed a new plan. And his plan, we know, was Jesus. Now, as we come into this Advent period, we have an opportunity. Advent has intentionally been built into the Christian calendar because it's recognised that a period of waiting and preparation is really valuable. And we can choose in this Advent period, we can choose how we use it. Now, I know if we go back to my kitchen being delivered, which I'm happy to talk about for as long as you like, but probably it isn't so relevant for me to spend 10 minutes on that. But when my kitchen's being delivered in 10 days, did I tell you? But that means I have this week and this week only, which is actually only 3 child-free days, where I can buy all of my Christmas presents, wrap them all, put them in my caravan, and then forget that Christmas is ever coming. And then I can focus fully on fitting my kitchen and getting that ready. And I think often culturally that's our focus, that's our preparation for Christmas, isn't it? We think about the things we need to buy, we think about the events we need to attend, the food we need to get in because we're hosting, all of these things. We think about preparing ourselves, psyching ourselves up for the tricky family dynamics maybe, but Do we spend enough time preparing our hearts, our souls, our minds for the coming of Jesus? We've heard the story again and again, haven't we? And it can be easy to become a bit blasé. The Israelites had another period of waiting, and that period of waiting was waiting for their Messiah. And some of them are still waiting, because actually most of the Israelites, when Jesus came, they missed it. Didn't recognise him as the one who was fulfilling the promise of the Messiah. They missed it. Let's not miss the point of Christmas this year. Let's use Advent as our waiting, as our preparation, as our chance to purify and reset. Let's allow God to work in us and through us in the waiting. Let us regain the wonder of what God did through Jesus' birth, life, death and resurrection. Let us get God's perspective on our priorities and give those a bit of a reset too. But let's not forget, this Advent period, Jesus coming, is not just for us. The Israelites never got to the point where they shared the good news with all the nations. Let us not make the same mistake. Let's not miss Christmas, but let's also not miss the opportunity to share the good news with those around us. So as we enter Advent, let's be intentional. Intentional so we don't miss the wonder and the significance. Intentional so that we share that wonder and significance with those around us.